Israel and into his campaign. So needless to say, Serbs for Trump were very prominent. We campaigned around the country with Ambassador Richard Brunel. And the reason why it was such a big deal in 2020 was because there are very specific data points that in 2016, those districts where Serbian Americans lived in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania swing the vote from Hillary Clinton to President Trump. Why? Because the Serbs did not want to elect Hillary Clinton. That was certainly something that we knew we didn't want to. We didn't know what we were getting into with President Trump, but certainly we knew that we needed a new breath of fresh air in our political process and in our nation. So that is the reason why I thought that it would be an important momentum in 2020 to galvanize that ethnic vote and minority vote, and we are certainly looking to do that in 2022, which is why we launched the PAC, Serbian American Voters Alliance. And again, thank you all for being here, because that is precisely what you are supporting tonight. We are looking to elect the candidates that will uphold our Constitution, that will bring the United States back to where our forefathers thought we need to be as a nation, and that will support America First policies. And that is our mission. However, the reason why we really wanted to have Colonel Douglas MacGregor here is because we need to have some serious discussions about the process that has taken place in 2020, and do we have a chance to beat the process in 2022? Because now we know that the country essentially is completely taken over by certain ideologies, that even that Democratic Party of the JFK, we have a lot of Serbs who used to be Democrats, who grew up Democrats. I have a wonderful guest here who flew from Washington, D.C., Mr. Olga, who actually runs the economic office of Republika Srpska. But he is a Serbian American, an American Serb, who was born here in Chicago, and I know a lot of his brethren from Chicagoland were born and raised as Democrats. Am I right?
My first Republican.
There you go. But see, that is not the party of the JFK anymore. And it is something that we are looking to change. So even if we are going to have this multipolarity, and if we are going to live in a pluralist society that we were intended to, our immigrant communities are going to be on the front lines to defend this nation, because sometimes we have these conversations, and we've been talking in the car, and a lot of you have expressed that our American friends who have been here for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, they don't really understand. The Serbs were almost the first ones to experience the colored revolution, the regime change, the weaponizing of the agencies, but those weaponized agencies were weaponized against our duly elected president. So all the things that we have experienced elsewhere around the world, it was the playground to actually bring it now over here. And I'm sure Colonel MacGregor and most of you will agree with me that we probably did win this past election, but it is what it is.
Yes.
And that is why we have to have these important conversations now and figure out how we are going to move forward. Because certainly we are in unprecedented times. I also want to take an opportunity to thank my husband, who's always been with me. And I understand that sometimes this gets frustrating along with our children, Christian and Leonardo. But they are two young boys who truly understand the meaning of loving your country. And simply because it is constantly in our household, they of course have grown to understand politics and love politics, and certainly they wanted to meet Colonel MacGregor tonight. I want to thank our friends from Renaissance Country Club. We had some amazing discussions not too long ago, not about, and this was something that has been expressed to me by Ambassador Brunel, even by our friend General Mike Flynn, who Christy and I was happy to be a part of that, brought here to Southwest Florida. We need solutions. And I am hoping that we are going to have that with Colonel Macgregor. Mr. Jeff here expressed a few wonderful ideas to me not too long ago, how we move forward, how we look at the school boards, how we look at the textbooks that our children are learning from, how we get engaged on the local level, and I know that we were having that conversation in the car with Kim, how important for everybody is to have that local level engagement, but for us, foreign policy buffs, it is something that we really want to drill down, and that is that foreign policy and serving the globalist elites and serving special interests and serving military-industrial complex directly affects what happens on the local level, including the fact that we don't have goods that are coming into the country now, that we are having issues with that the gas prices are skyrocketing. Anything that you buy at the store somehow is in fact affected by our foreign policy. So hopefully we will have that discussion. I would like to bring our friend Alex to say a few words and to please say a prayer for all of us.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much. What's his name again?
I forgot.
If you don't know, I'll shut your microphone.
Thank you. I always respected in my life people with convictions. And it didn't matter if people had convictions that were not my convictions. It doesn't mean I agree with them, but I always like people with convictions. And the same is true of God. God loves people with convictions. And He does not like lukewarm people. But isn't it interesting that in America, and I've been here 29 years, I came from Paris, France, escaped socialism, after my parents escaped communism and the former Yugoslavia. Isn't it interesting that America is losing its compass, moral compass, where we're told nowadays that when I came to America, America stood firm on its Judeo-Christian roots. But yet today, our kids are taught in school that there are no truths, no absolutes. And yet the people who don't believe in absolutes believe that all ideas are relative are the ones who get upset the most at you for disagreeing with them. Isn't it interesting that people who don't believe in absolutes are upset when you don't agree with their absolutes? Because everybody believes in absolutes. It's just that they want to divide us and to make us quiet so that we would not fight for what is true and right and beautiful. But yet we are called as people of God, if we're believers in our Lord Jesus and we're Christians, we're to stand firm on our faith. I'm reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, where the Apostle Paul says, stand firm. Do not let anything move you, but in everything work fully in the work of the Lord that's been set and prepared for you. So we ought to be fighting for what is true, and for too long, Christians in America have been quiet, silence, dormant, and the church has been quiet, but this is the time for us to fight, because we have to fight for the soul of America. If we lose this country for God, the whole world will fall. And what I love about Colonel Macgregor is that he's a man of convictions. And by the way, like I said, I don't always agree with people I respect. Think about it this way. If somebody believes in communism and lives as a communist and gives everything away to the poor, respect. They're putting their money where their mouth is. But most people, sadly, don't do that. So somebody like Michael Moore is a hypocrite, because he says everybody should live on $24,000 a year, but he doesn't do that. He lives like a capitalist, yet he goes around and criticizes capitalism. So we ought to be having conversations with people we don't agree with and try to lead them the right way. And we have to take our educational system back, because our kids are being brainwashed day in, day out. And the thing with my parents, they left the former Yugoslavia. The first thing that happens when communists take over, they get rid of religion. They get rid of God. Because when people give their allegiance to God, right, then it's going to be much harder to control their minds, because their allegiance will be to God, and they will be doing the right thing, not just worshipping the state. And then I went to France, a very secular country, but you have to understand that Europe was based on Judeo-Christian roots also. And yet, we're destroying the foundation on which we are standing. So it's Alexander Hamilton who said, let me try to remember, he said, if you don't stand firm on what you believe, you'll end up believing in anything. You'll fall for anything.
Yeah.
So you have to stand strong on what you believe, otherwise there's nothing to stand on, and then society falls apart. And that's why the only answer to radical Islam is Christianity. But if we don't have answers to radical Christianity, then we will not have answers, and then it will keep rising. The radical left does not have answers to any of the threats. Only Christianity has answers to all the threats to society. So my prayer right now will be that we will stand firm on what we believe, our convictions, and that we will be vocal about it without hating, just having a conversation, a dialogue, because this is what America is all about. When I came to America, one of the things that I fell in love with is that you could have conversations with people and they wouldn't hate you. They would disagree with you, but they wouldn't hate you. Today, you can't have a conversation with anybody who doesn't agree with you. Suddenly, they hate you and call you names. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you're racist. Where did that come from, right? So name calling, because that's a trick of the enemy, to just corner you and make you feel guilty so that you wouldn't stand for what you believe. But we have to stand firm, even if it means losing everything, because people have sacrificed themselves for this nation, people in the military, for our sake. I always have the highest amount of respect for the young men and women who went to Europe, to the Normandy beaches, because thanks to them, sacrificing everything, their whole lives, their future, right? Their future families, everything else, their dreams in life, we could have freedom. So this is the time for us to sacrifice our comfort, to get out of our comfort zone, and to stand up for what is true and beautiful. So if you pray with me, please bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we just come to you right now and thank you, Lord. Thank you so much for your love, your grace, and your patience with this nation, Lord. You've been patient with Israel in the Old Testament, and with your church, and with America. And we ask you, Lord, that you will please forgive us, that we will repent, turn back to you, and go back to what is true, beautiful, and fight for the soul of this country, and fight to defend your truth, Lord, which is the gospel, and to bring the gospel to the whole world, which liberates people from the snares of the devil. And Lord, we just thank you for this time together. Thank you for Olga and Nick. Thank you for Colonel Macgregor and the courage they have to stand up for truth, no matter what the cost is, because this nation, it was built on truth. And we just ask you, Lord, that we would recapture the soul of this country, and we get back to what would make this country so great, and that attracted foreigners like me, like Nick and Olga, and so many here in this room, that came to this country looking for an opportunity, looking for freedom, Lord. But we know that freedom comes only by your power, by your Holy Spirit, and we ask for you to come and invade this country again, to bring a revival so that people will turn back to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I want to add one thing that I started saying in the beginning. The interesting thing about Serbian Americans and even French, the only flag that ever flew over the White House was in fact the Serbian flag, and that was during World War I. And the other flag, the only other flag that flew over the White House was also the French flag. And the Serbs and the French and the Americans were in fact allies in World War I, in World War II. Speaking about Normandy, there were a lot of highly decorated Serbian military men who actually led the charge on the beaches of Normandy. The greatest rescue mission that ever happened in history of warfare happened over Serbia, when Serbian villagers and Serbian Royal Army, what was called then the Chetniks, rescued 500 military American and Allied airmen. So that is why President Trump recognized the importance of our mission, and that is why we will continue our mission, not only for the Serbs, but for all of our friends, because first and foremost, we are all Americans, and America is certainly worth fighting for. And on that note, I would like to ask Captain Wayne Smith to say a couple of words. Captain Wayne Smith, please. I just want to introduce Captain Wayne Smith as an incredible patriot, a veteran, and somebody who has a story to tell about his flight during his service. And we thank you, sir, for your service.
This is very unexpected.
Well, I told folks that I
forgot to tell him.
He forgot. No, I forgot to tell.
Let's see, what happened, about 2 hours?
Yeah.
Few
About
minutes.
2 minutes. That's a little better. No, I guess some of you may not know, but what's really unique about my military experience was on my 90th mission flying F-4, I was shot down over Hanoi. And I spent 5 years and 2 months as a prisoner of war most of it in Hanoi. I spent 2 months in a bunker on the China border. But anyway, I was very, very fortunate to survive that. There are not that many of us alive today, though, because, well, like I say, I was 24 when I was shot down and almost 30 when I came out. But most of my good friends left. We even had several guys, by the way, who were bird colonels that all obviously had passed away. I flew under the infamous Robin Olds, by the way. Had a big handlebar mustache.
Oh, yeah.
I flew an F-4 out of Ubon, Thailand. But Robin Olds was absolutely the most amazing fighter pilot that I've ever heard, been near. Just absolutely. I remember the first time I saw him, he was in my flight suit, got out of the airplane in Ubon, Thailand, having ferried it all the way from Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. Nice long trip, by the way. A lot of tankers and stuff like that. We got it over there. Still in my flight suit, it's hot as heck in Ubon, Thailand. I walked up, and the first thing I did was to go in, flight suit and all, to see Robin Olds. Had a big handlebar mustache. He shot down about 17 aircraft in World War II, and then in Korea he had another 5 or so. And he wanted to be the only ace in 3 wars, and he had 4 when I got there. And so I just saw Colonel Robin Olds, the handlebar mustache, about 6'4". I said, Colonel Olds, it's such a privilege to meet you. And he immediately looked in my flight suit, and in a flight suit, you've got a little place for you holding pencils. Had an eraser on it. He pulls out that pencil and he says, Lieutenant Smith. And he takes that pencil and breaks it in half. Holds it up and he says, we don't make mistakes around here. It'll get you killed. Because it had an eraser. He would make it happen. But anyway, that's my story.
You are with us today, and we are thankful for that. And now, without further ado, our wonderful guest of honor. So obviously, he was President Trump's pick, his last appointment, if I'm not mistaken, to the Pentagon. He was supposed to take over the position of U.S. Ambassador to Germany after Ambassador Grenell. But I've heard all about the people who were against that in the Senate, so we're going to reconsider who and how we support them. But needless to say, for those of us who have been on the front lines, particularly of foreign policy, we have followed Colonel Macgregor, who is a man of conviction, who is a man who always stood his principles. You can often see him on Tucker Carlson. He is probably one of our most decorated veterans and somebody that I have a great respect for because he always stood his ground, and my personal opinion, it probably cost him a little bit of a career. This is our general material here, but he retired from the military in 2004. Brilliant, brilliant mind that I am so happy that we have with us today. Colonel Macgregor, welcome.
Woo!
Thank you to God for Douglas MacGregor. I mean, in the prayer, I've never heard anyone say, Lord, thank you for Douglas MacGregor. Nobody, not even my parents. That's the first. I appreciate that very much. It's good to be here. You have rescued me from the Beltway, extricated me from Washington, the district of corruption. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I've got a very good friend who works with me, and her name is Kimberly Gorak. Just stand up, Kimberly. She's a refugee from San Diego. For some reason decided she wanted to go to Washington, D.C. and get involved in politics. But she's stuck with me through thick and thin, and I think if things had worked out differently, she would have been with me over in Berlin and probably back in the Department of Defense too later on. But it didn't work out. So what are we here to talk about? Well, you stole a lot of my thunder. I must say, everyone stood up here and said almost all the right things, so I'll try to elaborate a little bit. But first I'm going to tell you, on the way over here talking to Olga, we were talking about speeches, presentations, audiences, and how they react, and she was telling me, it takes me back a few years because just before I left the Army in 2004 to talk about international relations, by the way, I was sitting at my desk ready, sort of cleaning things out, and I got this call. Phone rings. Somebody in the Pentagon, I don't know who it was, a civilian in the Office of Secretary of Defense says, "This Colonel," I said, "Yes. It's very important that you listen carefully to me because I have important instructions for you." I said, "All right. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, you are flying from Washington Reagan National to Logan Airport in Boston. You are going to be picked up and taken to the Kennedy School. You're going to be addressing an audience of 14 Russian generals and a collection of aides and strap hangers that are with them, so roughly 20, 25 people. As it turned out, there were like 60 people in there because the rafters were full of all these hanging on generals and colonels from the U.S. Armed Forces. And we want you to talk to them about transformation, military transformation. Of course, that's something we talk a lot about. It never happens. But I said, all right, what do I need to do? Wear civilian clothes, don't wear your uniform. This is not that kind of event. And speak to them. I said, how long does this have to be? He said, well, about 30 minutes would be good. And then there's the president. Okay, fine. Recognize this is a year into the Iraq debacle. And I had addressed Russian audiences before when I was the director of joint operations at Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe. And so I was very concerned because I wanted to be sure that these people would be sober. Russian generals are not usually sober. So I got in there and then I began to worry, well, at 10 o'clock in the morning, are these people going to be hungover? Because if they're not sober, or they are sober, they're going to be miserable. Fortunately, they had behaved themselves in the previous 24 hours. So I stood up there and I started to talk, and the translators were sort of in little cages behind glass, and they kept saying, slow down because I was going too fast. And I finished, and I said, gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Are there any questions? And so they all sit there with me. And the man in the middle was the Colonel General, the 4-star Colonel. You usually tell them because in the Russian military, they're corporate, comfortable. He takes off his headgear, he puts it down, he says, "Colonel Macgregor, have you ever been to Moscow?" I said, "Yes, sir, I have." "Did you like it?" I said, "Well, sir, I enjoyed it, but it would have been better if I could have spoken some Russian." "Oh, you don't need to speak much Russian. You only need to know 2 words in Moscow.
Vodka.
Please and shit. Please and shit, that's all you need." I didn't know what I was supposed to do at that point, so I thought, and I said, well, I guess the vocabulary in Moscow exceeds the vocabulary of the United States Army. For the last 28 years, the only word I ever needed was shit. At which point, for the first time, all of these generals were, "Whoa!" I don't know what happened after that. After that, there was some question about NATO, and they said, well, you're putting things into Romania, and that is dangerous. And I said, General, are you telling me that the Russian army is afraid of the Romanian army? If that's true, that is a dramatic change in world history. Ooh! I started laughing. No, I'm not afraid of the Romanians. I said, well, then don't worry about NATO and Romania. That was the end of the discussion. But you never know when you walk in and see an audience exactly what you're going to be dealing with. So first, before I go any further, I'm supposed to say a couple of things. First, Tucker Carlson sends you his best, and he means that.
Thank you. Oh, I love him.
He appreciates your support. He does read emails whenever you send things in, and he is particularly sensitive to Florida. He has a small home over in Boca Raton, and he goes to that during the winter. In fact, I think he'll be here shortly. And he has another home up in Maine, which I visited recently. We did an hour interview. He asked me lots of interesting questions. You can see it on Fox Nation if you want to fight your way onto that thing and pay the fee.
We'll get Tucker on this side.
At any rate, he's got a nice place up there, and he took this $30,000 wooden building that I think looked like a giant outhouse to me. And he poured about $1 million into it, turned it into a fabulous studio. So when you go into the thing, you go inside, it's sort of like The Wizard of Oz. You know, you step out of the house and everything's in color. Because the place in Maine is just, I can't understand why the man has gone 90 minutes into the middle of Maine. I mean, been to Maine?
No.
You stay on the coast. So anyhow, he loves it, and everybody that goes visits him up there. You have to drive there. There's no other way to get in. You can't fly into anything, and it's sort of like driving into eastern Siberia. And then out of nowhere is this place called Bethel, Maine. It's probably originally was called Vladivostok before they changed it. At any rate, I went up there and they put me in a hotel for a night. It was weird. It was in sort of Stephen King territory. And the driver was the driver for Stephen King normally. And I said to him, what's the story on this man, Stephen King? He said, oh, he's very strange. Anyhow, so that's first thing, Tucker Carlson. Secondly, I want to talk to you and share a couple of things, insights about me, so perhaps you will understand me, because I am going to talk tonight about American nationalism. You've already spoken about globalism versus national sovereignty. I talk about globalism versus nationalism, because that's really the heart of the conflict here. The real question is, who are we and what do we stand for? That was pretty clear some time ago. It's not so clear anymore, and that's by design, and that's why I want to mention this. When I was 10, my grandfather, my mother's father, took me out to Gettysburg. The reason he took me there is that was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. It turned out that as a child at the dinner table in 1901, he listened to his great uncle, who had lost his left leg from the knee down in the Battle of Gettysburg. And he was in one of the Pennsylvania infantry regiments as a young lieutenant, very young man, lost his leg, but he fought in the battle, and he would talk about what happened and the people he met. But the crux of it was he laid on this battlefield for 2 days.
Wow.
And did everything he could to try and stop the bleeding, but it was 2 days later that he was finally picked up by surgeons, Union Army surgeons, and there were some Confederate Army surgeons. They were all working together to try and repair this terrible damage. Ended up being carried off, but they had to amputate his leg from the knee down. So he said, you've got to go to Gettysburg. We took the train out, which you still could in those days from Philadelphia, and we went and we watched this whole reenactment, which I thought was brilliant. And if I stop and think today, this is 2021, how many people can say they listened to a first-person narrative from the second person that heard it about the Battle of Gettysburg? Not too many people. And of course, the picture is very different, but it was part of this business of building his view of American national identity. He had fought in the First World War. We were Quakers on his side, but his older brother had pulled the American flag down off the Quaker Meeting House when we declared war on Germany and burned it. And Woodrow Wilson was very tough in those days and put him in jail for 6 months. My mother's family had not directly served in the military very often, but people had defected, as we did during the Civil War, for reasons of obvious preserve the Union, eliminate slavery. But my grandfather was summoned to the room to talk to his great-grandfather, and he said, Henry, I love your older brother, but this is too much. This is a stain on the honor of the family. He said, don't worry about it, I will serve in the Army. As soon as I graduated from Penn, I would enlist. So he did. And he came back a bitter opponent of interventions anywhere. He thought going into the First World War, the only thing we did was to rescue British and French imperialism. He hated every minute of it. He thought it was terrible. He loved the military. He loved the soldiers. Talked about how brave and courageous they were. And we don't really appreciate what went on in that war. We took 318,000 casualties in 110 days of fighting. We lost 1,000 dead in every battle. And every November 11th, he would sit down and cry, because he was in the 29th Division that came from Pennsylvania. When they marched back up Broadway, they left all the gaps in the ranks where everyone had been killed or wounded. And they called the 29th Division the Bucket of Blood, because in the first battle, they took 68% casualties. And continued to fight, which today seems incomprehensible to most Americans. That's real war. And he ended up in the second and served him through Korea. It's a long story. He didn't like any of it. He was opposed to all these wars, but he served. And when Vietnam came along, my mother, who was the president of the Republican woman of Pennsylvania, very patriotic, she flew during the Second World War as a pilot. She was a very interesting woman. Triple major in chemistry, physics, and math, which drove me insane all through the military academy. But she said, well, we've got to support the troops. And she volunteered her time at Valley Forge Military General Hospital. Valley Forge Army General, it doesn't exist anymore. They've torn it all down. It was one of these old barrack things left over in the Second World War. And he would look at her and he said, well, if you want to support the troops in Vietnam, get them the hell out of there and bring them home. So I was raised in this strange sort of conflicting environment, if you will. And when I finally applied to go to West Point, I had to take my physical at Valley Forge General Hospital. So she drives me up there. I went through, finished it, and this is 1970. This is the first time I tried for a nominator or an appointment. I came out, she said, all right, now come with me. And she took me back into the hospital. And she took me into one of these long barrack buildings. You'll remember those. I know, you know what I'm talking about. And this ward was full of people my age, 18, 19, 20, I was 17 at the time, who were amputees. And she said, walk down this ward, look at every man, every bed. So I did. And then after it was over, she brought me outside. She said, now, do you really want to go to West Point? I said, yes, Mama, I do. She said, well, you were a hard case. But I will do everything I can to get you in. But that was my introduction. So I never harbored any illusions about what it was that I would ultimately face. But the reason I bring these things up is this is what turns you into an American, these kinds of experiences. Your connection to the people that are actually involved in what's going on. I grew up, as I was telling Olga, in a very strange neighborhood in North Philadelphia. It was overwhelmingly Ukrainian and Polish. And my grandfather steadfastly refused to move anywhere. He said, no, you're going to stay here. You're going to go out there and you're going to find out all about these people that you possibly can know. Because we were, proverbial wasps, completely disconnected from all these so-called immigrants. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. And one of the things that I witnessed when I was 14, this would have been 1967, 68. One of my friends, his name was Stanislav Jan Mokrzycki. His family came from Przemysław, which is not far from the border with Ukraine. And you can imagine what we did with the name Mokrzycki. So we called him Stosh. And Stosh came out to play baseball, and Stosh had a black eye and clearly been beaten up. We said, Stosh, what the hell happened to you? He said, well, last night I told my father, you're not going to draft me, I'm going to go to Canada. And he beat me up. And he said, you are the greatest country in the world. If this country fights communism, you are going to fight communism. You are going to fight for this country no matter what. He did, and he survived. He wasn't wounded, he served in the army. All of the children I grew up with did that. And they were all first generation, some second, so-called immigrants. Europeans, but they were from Central East Europe for the most part, Lithuanians, Poles, Ukrainians. The most ferocious Americans I've ever met. Really. And I went to a Quaker private school. We had wasps and some Jews. That was it. That's all over there. All of them tried to declare themselves as conscientious objectors. They didn't want to fight. So, I'm not going to go, My dad will get me out of this. None of them went. And I was so disgusted at that young age that the people with whom I was essentially kin, to put it bluntly, the people that I knew well, would not fight for this country. They had everything. They were wealthy. People I grew up with didn't have anything. These are working class individuals, worked in factories at the Navy Yard, worked in steel mills, yet they were willing to do anything. And these people grew up with wonderful values. They were solid. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have enough of them anymore because the immigration we're being subjected to doesn't support that. That's not the message. The message is, oh, come here and you can be what you've always been. You don't need to change. There's no requirement to believe in anything. Why, do whatever you like. Respect whatever you like or not. And is it a surprise that large numbers of the non-Europeans coming into this country absolutely have no use for anything that is American? I'm in a neighborhood right now, I just sold my house. It's overwhelmingly South Asian, largely Indian, with some people from Pakistan. And they're perfectly nice people, but they have citizenship in many cases. But I asked them, you know, are you worried about the economy? Oh, no, I don't think so. Really? I said, well, we're very concerned about the economy. What are you going to do if everything tanks? If everything falls apart? Oh, I will not worry. I'm going to go back to India. If it gets better, I'll be back. And I remembered Philadelphia in the 1960s, and then I heard this, and something dawned on me. This is a microcosm of everything that's wrong now in the United States. Because we have a huge problem with a class of so-called elites, the people that are wealthy, very wealthy in many cases, and they are, as the Russians used to call certain individuals many, many years ago, ruthless cosmopolitans. These are the people we refer to as Davos or Davos people. They live above all of this. They have no connection to the country. There is nothing there that holds them in place. And they are largely responsible, in my judgment, for the condition that we are in today. And many of us were surprised about what happened. We shouldn't have been, because there were lots of indicators. And I know that the president feels that way now. But that group, more than anything else, is what we're up against. And the other things that you see, whether it's BLM or Antifa or something, those are just foot soldiers.
Yes.
They're being deployed to attack us. And we are the enemy, ladies and gentlemen, because we are Americans. You see, we have a sense of identity. We have a set of beliefs, and we're willing to do something about it. At least I think we are. Because when you start to look at people that are much younger than most of us in this room, there are a lot of people that are very confused. That, well, I'm not so concerned. This isn't all that bad. And that's part of what I want to discuss tonight. So I want to turn now to the two major points that I wanted to leave you with this evening. And Kimberly's supposed to signal me when I'm going too far. I do have some notes. I wanted to show you my notes. Because I believe in Winston Churchill. When Winston Churchill was Prime Minister during World War II,
My country.
we had these giant staff studies that were like 300 pages. And he would throw them across the room at the generals and say, this bloody thing, I'm not going to read it. Its very length defends itself against being read. Don't send these things to me. So everything had to be a 2 or 3 page document, which is right. God forbid that they should have had PowerPoint if they hadn't been close to it. Because now we have nothing but PowerPoint rangers. And you know the problem with PowerPoint, it puts up with anything you put on it. There's no thinking involved. We live in the age of the soundbite. I mean, I was asked when I was being considered for the job in Berlin, Colonel Macgregor, you have almost no presence on media. You're not on Facebook, you don't tweet. I said, no. I think tweeting is an opportunity to be stupid. I don't go on Facebook.
Our president.
I don't want any of the girlfriends popping up, but there are other reasons why I don't go on Facebook. They don't even know where I am in most cases. You know, I'm very sensitive about privacy, so you can imagine how I react to these new initiatives. Monitoring bank accounts, somebody moves $10,000.
600.
What is it? 6? It's
600. Started at
it's insane. So the two things I want to talk about that are very important because these affect you, and you need to talk to everyone that you know about. One is what I call the Biden administration's two-front war. And I'll explain what that means. Two-front war. And secondly, at the end of this, I want to talk about the Second Republic. we have to build when this one finally dies.
Yep.
Because, ladies and gentlemen, the republic that you've known, that I've known, that I grew up with, that I took for granted, is dying right in front of us.
Amen.
That's not the end of our country, but it's the end of the first republic. And we're going to have to start thinking about the next one. And we're the ones that are going to have to build it. I'll come back to that. Now, what's the two-front war? Well, the first front is overseas. You're familiar with all of these plans for regime change everywhere. Our intervention, our meddling, our use of sanctions, as Ron Paul used to say, sanctions are effectively an act of war. Well, he was correct. But these people have discovered two things. First of all, since we have this large nuclear arsenal, no one is really willing to challenge us to an existential fight. Thank God. There's no reason for that to happen. But that has empowered people because they discovered in 1991, they thought they discovered that we had this invincible military establishment. Well, what they didn't tell everybody is that it looked very good, and I was part of it, because we fought someone who wasn't very good. They just weren't that impressive. And we have carefully picked individual countries and places and peoples that were not terribly well armed, or for various reasons simply didn't have the wherewithal to reach out and touch us, so that we could strike with impunity. This then became kind of a giant scam. Your defense budget rose and rose and rose. Today it is higher than it's ever been in the history of the United States. And in real dollars, we're spending almost as much now as we did during the Second World War, which is insane because look who we're fighting. And then people say, well, why can't we win any wars? Well, there's an easy answer to that. In April of 2004, I had another month on duty. I was asked by Secretary Rumsfeld to go over to the House of Representatives and talk to some members of the House Armed Services Committee. One of them was Calvert from California, another one was Thornberry from Texas. There were some Democrats and Republicans there. They said, well, we want to hear what you think about Fallujah. And I said, well, what do you want me to tell you? They said, well, what do you think we should do about Fallujah? I said, bring every tank, bring every gun, surround it, cut it off. Then, on two axes, go into it. After you've emptied it of all the people that are voluntarily willing to leave, you put them in a little encampment outside the encircled town. And you smash anything and everything that doesn't immediately surrender. Well, you'll end up destroying the whole town. I said, there's a good chance of that. They said, oh my God, you know, you're killing all these people. I said, yeah, that's true. They said, we can never do that. And I said, that is why we should not be there. Because it's our unwillingness to do that that makes our presence in that country laughable. If you're not willing to let the town that killed American soldiers, they'll kill more American soldiers. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. This is not Stockholm, Sweden. This is not Seattle, Washington. This is Iraq. By the way, Iraq is an artificial construct.
Yes.
There are tribes and clans. People know who their sixth cousins are. You know, they don't have relationships. They have with people they don't know and aren't related to. You're either a benefactor or you're a client or you're a relative. If you're not one of those things, you're out. If you're not a Muslim, you're dead. You're irrelevant. We didn't understand. I listened to all of these four stars. I went to school with them. I roomed with some of them. Well, we just didn't understand the culture. I think somebody said that about Vietnam. That's a lot of crap.
Yeah.
We absolutely understood. Then what are they really saying? They say, well, we went along because the idea, ladies and gentlemen, was to spend a lot of money. And where did that money go? Well, some of it obviously was stolen, misappropriated, went through various channels, laundered, and disappeared into bank accounts, just like the last son of the Afghan president who's just bought a $30 million estate somewhere. But most of it came back to Washington, and it went into the defense industries, and into people who donate to campaigns on the Hill. So when you ask, why are we so much money, that's a big part of it. It has to do with lining pockets inside this country. And they always knew that if they didn't take very many casualties, no one would notice. Oh, well, 3 American soldiers were killed last month. What else is on TV? What they didn't want is 3,000 American soldiers were killed today, because that would wake everyone up. We lost 90,000 casualties from the 6th of June until the 6th of December. Then when the bulge broke, we lost 200,000 casualties in December and January. Of course, we lied and said it was only 70,000, but it's not true. The real figures were always kept from the public. They slow rolled the casualties. The Germans only took 68,000 casualties, of whom only 11,000 were killed. What's wrong with that picture? They wanted to relieve Eisenhower. There was a push to relieve Bradley. It was inexcusable that we could have been caught that way, but nothing happened. It was covered up. The war was almost over. These things have been going on for a while. We were not this bright, shining force that merrily marched in victory all the way to Berlin and had a wonderful time. Remember, we never faced more than 25% of the German armed forces. Putin has his problems with this too. During the Second World War, they lost at least 40 million, twice what they admitted. The lesson of the Second World War is don't fight the Germans, because they know what they were doing. Now, why am I saying these things? Because for the last 30 years, but especially the last 20, we have not really been at war. We haven't. No, yes, people are being killed, they've been shot at. For the poor soldier, sailor, airman, or marine who's on the patrol that drives by the improvised explosive device, it's a war. He's blown up, he's killed, he loses an arm or a leg, whatever. But it's not enough to bother the folks back home. And we're fighting an insurgent enemy, lightly equipped, has no army, has no air force, has no real air defense. When this man fought in Vietnam, he was up against serious air defenses. We haven't seen anything like that since. So we stand around and pat ourselves on the back every day. And I had this discussion with the president who finally got around to it. He really understood it. I said, we got to stop saying, we're the greatest armed forces. You know what we have? We have more generals than anybody else on the planet. Right now we have 43 4-stars on active duty in the United States Armed Forces. 43. We have a force of 1.18 million. During World War II, when it was the height of the war, we had 12.2 million men under arms. And how many 4-stars did we have? 7. I can reel off the names: MacArthur, Marshall, Arnold, and Eisenhower. Army. And on the Navy side, you had a Marine 3-star who managed to command 895,000 Marines. And then you had 3 4-star admirals. King, Nimitz, I'm trying to remember. King and Nimitz, who was the other one? Escapes me at the moment. I'll think of it later on. But only 7 4-stars. Marshall was regularly accosted when he would visit the Senate and the House, and they would say, General Marshall, we want you to promote General so-and-so. He's from my state of Michigan, my state of Iowa. He's a really great guy. We think he should be a 4-star. He said, Senator, don't tell me that. So why not? He said, we've got to win the war. I don't have time to argue with more 4-stars. I got to get the job done. Ladies and gentlemen, this whole thing has become an industry in Washington. We have all these regional unified commands. This is the age of digital communications, space-based communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. You don't need all these commands. We could probably do it with 2, east, west. You just don't need it. And the armed forces, all we see every year is more generals, more admirals, and fewer soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marines who can actually deploy and fight. Now, people have figured this out, but now we have a new problem on top of the old one. Now we have critical race theory. Now we have equity. And what we're being told is everything wrong in the United States is the fault of the quote-unquote white man, the European. everything wrong here is our fault. This would be such a better place if only it reflected the nature, character of everything that is not European. Well, good luck with that. The possibility that when we got to the New World, that the Stone Age peoples lived here, reached the average age of 30 before expiring, doesn't seem to occur to anyone. That they lived in unspeakable filth and unsanitary conditions, and they brutally murdered each other when they weren't eating each other. And this is the great civilization that we destroyed. It's nonsense. All needs to go away. And this business about slavery. Slavery was a business, and millions of slaves in the South represented human capital, but they also represented money. Billions and billions of dollars that had been invested in them. The British ended slavery very intelligently. They paid off the owners. 9 billion pounds, which is a lot of money. It worked.
Sweet did.
We refused to do that. We went to war. It was a catastrophe. It didn't need to happen. There were hotheads in the South and fools in the North, and the outcome was a disaster for the American people. But the people that fought that war, what we don't understand is that most of them never went anywhere more than 20 miles from the place where they were born. So when the war broke out, if you lived in Mississippi, or Arkansas, or Texas, Virginia, and somebody said, "We're at war. Who are we fighting?" "We're fighting the North." "Why?" "They want to invade. They want to change our society." 98% of them own no slaves. So they went to war. To do what? To defend their country. Not for any sinister or evil reason. We understood that. That's why we had a reconciliation after the war. And that reconciliation has worked very well, and we've made enormous progress. All of that is being thrown away. It's being tossed into the ash heap of history. And it's being done because they want to divert and distract your attention from what they're doing at home by what's happening overseas. You know what's happening overseas? Not much. Every day I read something about the Chinese. I've done business in Northeast Asia with the Koreans and the Japanese. I've seen the PLA. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese are many things. You can call them money-grubbing bastards. They are. They will steal, as my dear grandmother used to say, the pennies off a dead man's eyes. Don't hear that much anymore. I said that the other day. My son said, "What are you talking about?" But the Chinese are not militarily aggressive. And if you look carefully at the structure of their forces, it's all very defensive. It's all designed to keep us out. Why would they want to do that? Well, what have we been doing for the last 30, 40 years? Intervening in other people's countries, meddling in their affairs, trying to force them to become what we want them to become, and most of all, to become part of our larger monetary system, our larger banking system, which is an economic system designed to ultimately impoverish everyone else and enrich us. Only when I say us, I'm talking about a very small minority of people. Yeah. Because we are no longer the economy that we once were. We were an economy that was agricultural, then we became the greatest industrial power in the world. Before, in 1860, it took 100 American workers to roll out 3,000 tons of steel. In 1900, it took 6 men a day to roll out 3,000 tons of steel. We were ahead of everybody else. We took everything that worked from everyone. You've heard of Tesla. Why did Tesla come to the United States? For the same reason that Andrew Carnegie came to the United States and everybody else did. We were open to everything, to use everything, to build prosperity, to build up our country, not for the purpose of invading other people's homelands and other people's societies. We believe that George Washington was right when he said, along with Alexander Hamilton, the mission of the United States is to be the world's engine of prosperity. If we are prosperous and successful as a nation, others will want to emulate us. And that was his rationale for not involving ourselves in this horrific Holocaust called the French Revolution, where the French murdered most of the surviving upper class, destroyed their institutions. It was the first truly successful communist revolution, ladies and gentlemen. it was all overturned. Ultimately, Bonaparte saved France from total destruction. Then he wasted his opportunities, but that's another matter. But my point to you is, Washington and Hamilton looked at this and said, we want no part of this. So that's a very different approach, but it's an approach that we took and worked very well until Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson got us into trouble because World War I made us rich. Now, how could World War I make us rich? Because ultimately the British and the French got bogged down in the war, and they needed food and ammunition and equipment and weapons, and we sold it. And then during the interwar period, we insisted they pay us back in gold. Think about that. And yet, a third of the American population at the time of the First World War was German. No one was really interested in going to war, but we were dragged into it. It was a kind of Gulf of Tonkin moment that got us into that war. And we've been dealing with Gulf of Tonkin moments ever since. Heard about the WMD and mushroom cloud over Iraq. I was on active duty, and when I was asked, how would you intervene in Iraq and what would you do? No one said to me, we're going in there to eliminate WMD. I was told we're going in there to eliminate Saddam Hussein. And everybody I was involved with said, well, that means we eliminate him, we put a new bunch of generals in charge, and we get out, right? Because everybody knew if you stayed in this country long enough, you'd become a target because you're an alien presence. One general said we were a bacillus inside their society, but he did nothing to stop it. His name was Ravassi. He was paid off with 4 stars, and he still profited. So the point is, all of this has been done to distract you and divert your attention from what is happening here. And what is happening here, ladies and gentlemen, today is infinitely more important than anything beyond the borders of the United States. Anyone who tells you that, oh, well, the Russians and the Turks may go to war, or the Ukrainians may ally with the Turks against the Russians, and we can't allow this to happen. What happened in the 5,000 years before we began meddling in other people's affairs? The world went on, and in the absence of the United States armed forces in these people's countries, the world will go on. We can't save all of these people from themselves. We need to save ourselves at this point. That means we need to focus on what is happening here. You talked about the school board. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the tip of the iceberg that's underway right now. If you heard Merrick Garland testify today,
Yes,
you
yes.
could see him equivocate
Oh,
and how nervous and afraid he is. He is a committed Marxist.
oh, yes, yes,
He
yes.
is determined to turn us into something we don't want to become.
Yes.
And for him, we, our children, are the enemy. I wish I could stand up here and say, we're all going to live harmoniously on the model that Martin Luther King suggested. It's over. The racial division of this country is real, and they are exploiting it.
Yes.
They hope to create it.
Yes,
They've
yes,
inflamed it,
yes,
and it is all directed at us.
yes.
All right, that brings me to the last subject. That is the Second Republic. If the First Republic is gone, and I think it is, what would the Second Republic look like? Well, let's go back to the pre-Revolutionary War period. What really happened in British North America in the 1760s, after the 7 Years' War in Europe ended in 1763, was not so much that we walked away from Britain. We didn't walk away from the British Empire. We were British. We were wealthy. We were doing very well. At the time that the revolution actually began in 1776, we were better fed, better housed than most people in the world, especially in Europe. In fact, very few people know this, and I was going to mention this to Nick because he's so damn big, but during the Revolutionary War, the average American soldier was 3 to 4 inches taller than his British counterpart because he had better diet, he lived a better life. We were a success story. By the way, we were better educated and more literate than anybody else.
Than us British?
And that wasn't because we all sat around in the classroom, it was because of the people that we brought into the country. Now, the people that came to begin with weren't bad, but starting in 1815 until 1924, we had 32 million people come to the United States from Europe. De Tocqueville, the French author, who wrote about the United States in the 1840s, He talks about watching the immigrants. He said, these people aren't poor. They're not destitute. They're not unskilled. And they're not stupid. America is getting the best out of Europe. And that is exactly what we got.
Yes.
We definitely did. When I got to Germany as an exchange student, I started talking to my German parents who took care of me while I was there for a year from 16 to 17 years of age. They told me, they said, Douglas, you don't understand, the best that is left, they're living in America. And the people that left early were not sheeple. In other words, they weren't willing to fall in line and do whatever the hell they were told. The ones who stayed, oh, well, I'll put up with it. I'll deal with it. The ones who left, no, not so much. Those people made us great, but we had very, very, very high standards. And of that 32 million, 2 million went home. They left. They just couldn't assimilate. They couldn't do it. They could not become Americans. That's how cohesive and strong our society was. So is it a surprise that we go into World Wars I and World War II with millions of troops, millions of men who can fight, who are effective, who are competent, and can demonstrate that on the battlefield? No, it's not a surprise at all. But then we got caught up in the trap that I talked about earlier, the post-war trap. You have to stay. You have to ensure that nothing happens. Eisenhower said, if we are still in Europe in 10 years after NATO was founded, it's failed. We needed to get out. That was the old America. And he was probably the last version of it. Everybody else since then has found a reason to go everywhere because it's a self-enriching process. The 43 four-stars can't wait to retire and go to work for banks, go to work for consulting firms, go to work for defense industries to keep us involved. I listened to Millie just today talk about, oh, the Chinese. Did you see what they did with that rocket, that hypersonic missile? That's a dangerous thing. Ladies and gentlemen, that so-called rocket had a space launch vehicle on it, which is a duplicate of what the Boeing Corporation makes. It's designed to launch satellites. The missile did not fly over the Earth. It got into low Earth orbit. It's not a weapon. But what have you been hearing? The exact opposite. We don't have the Soviet Union anymore. We don't have Nazis. We don't have Imperial Japan. So in Asia, we have to have Imperial China modeled on Imperial Japan and the Soviet Union. And we're prepared to swing ourselves into oblivion. But ladies and gentlemen, warfare has changed. If you try to fight any nation, a continental power like China or Russia, or any number of them, on their doorstep, you're going to lose. Because today, anything that floats on the surface of the ocean within 150 nautical miles of China can be identified and sunk. We have integrated air defenses to deal with now that the Russians have perfected, using all of the microcircuitry and the precision technology that we once had a monopoly on since about 2006. You can shut everything down. Stealth is an illusion. And everyone's talking about, well, what about unmanned aircraft? You can shoot them down too. But are we prepared to do that? No. Do we have an integrated air defense for the United States? No. Do we have it for our forces in the field overseas? No. Are we building it? No. What we're continuing to build and what we're continuing to maintain at enormous expense is the same old force structure that we've had for the last 50 years. Just upgraded versions of old stuff. Imagine, had I gone to war in 1991 with an improved M60 designed at the end of the 50s. Well, that's what we have now in the Army and the Marines. Those soldiers and Marines are manning museums, and they are organized to fight on a battlefield that no longer exists. And if they are allowed to put their operations plans ever into effect and they deploy on the Eurasian landmass, the Russians, the Chinese, probably the Iranians, even the Turks, they will roll out their ISR capability from space and from unmanned systems. They will load up their tactical ballistic missiles and their BM-21 rocket artillery batteries, and they will annihilate us, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. But you're never told that. You're always, oh, we're the greatest, we're we're driving out people like us.
Vaccine mandates.
We're trying to drive us out with vaccines, drive us out with whatever they can find in the hopes of turning the armed forces into something that is not American in their view. Something they could use against us potentially. And a force they think will be good enough to defend us. I won't go into detail about the last point, but I can tell you right now, it's a very serious situation. And the people at the top, like a million others, have effectively sold their souls.
Yes. Yes.
They've sold out the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, but then again, they've been sold out for 20 years. They were sent on fool's errands. They weren't sent to win anything. They were sent to go over there and attract bullets and cause money to be spent.
Wow.
That's the truth. And there's something morally disgraceful about asking any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine to fight in something when there's no expectation of winning anything. Now we're starting to find it out. Americans are gradually waking up. And there's inevitably someone in the audience that says, I'm so appalled to listen to what you say. I think our generals are great, and so well, I don't.
Woo!
I've been watching them for a long time. 1991, I remember, this is on the night of the 27th of February, we fought quite an action. We were the lead unit into the country. Now I had 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns, 1,100 men. And we'd gone 150 miles, and we had annihilated large numbers of units, but most important, a brigade plus of the Iraqi Republican Guard. It lasted maybe 40 minutes. We lost 1 Bradley, 1 man killed, 6 wounded. And the decision was made to stop. And the question at the time I asked was, why? I thought we were supposed to go to Baghdad and end this. Oh, well, if we go there, we have to occupy it. No, we don't. Why would we occupy this place? We've got plenty of oil wells. They could rebuild. We just want to get rid of the people that won't do business with us and put someone else in there who will. I mean, if you'd said that to Bismarck, he'd have understood that. If you'd have said it to Disraeli or Palmerston, they'd have understood. If you said it to Teddy Roosevelt, I think he'd have understood. But instead, oh no. And the generals all rushed to celebrate this great victory. And we had over 500,000 troops involved, over 340,000 in the desert, and we quit. And we came home. And I remember standing on the docks, watching all the tanks and the guns loaded, and I said, well, in 10 years we'll be back. I was wrong, it was 12. Now this time, instead of simply doing what was originally planned, and removing who was there and putting somebody else in who was trustworthy, could work with us, because people never want to be ruled by foreigners. Where I grew up in North Philadelphia, if you sent the U.S. Army in there and occupied us and they tried to run the place, after 2 weeks, we'd have shot them. People are stupid. People do not want to be ruled by people who are different from them. So it never made any sense. The British learned that. How did they control 1/4 of the world's landmass and population for so long? They didn't rule it. In fact, in 1952, they had polling done in India, and less than 40% of the people polled knew that India had ever been under British rule. Genius. Genius. It worked. They stole $40 trillion and repatriated that money to Great Britain. That's what made Britain successful. It's the richest country in the world. We went and impoverished ourselves and created this enormous debt, which, by the way, everyone will tell you in Washington, even the so-called Republicans, oh, debt doesn't matter. Well, we'll just print more money. All you have to do now is hit the button over in the Fed and it all appears in the banks. Everything will be fine. Until 1967, we grew, from the moment we became a nation, 4% a year, real growth. Since then, it has been steadily declining due to debt financing consumption. We borrowed against our own people, and we became dependent upon foreign capital. There is no easy way out. We've exported our manufacturing base. Donald Trump understood this. He wanted to bring it back. He was dedicated to do it. But ladies and gentlemen, he was surrounded by people who were determined to subvert it and prevent it from happening.
Yep.
And my only concern now with President Trump is that too many of those people are still around him. Right now, there are only 2 people out there that ever say anything that represents my views. One of those is Donald Trump,
Yes.
and the other is Tucker Carlson.
Yes.
I don't hear,
Yes, and all of us in here.
I don't hear much of us.
Us.
And that's part of our problem, and that's the last thing I want to mention. What are we going to do? Some of you will remember in the 1760s, something emerged called committees of correspondence. These were committees that were formed independently of the legislatures in the 13 colonies by people who believed we had to work for independence from Great Britain. That went on all through the 1760s. Some of you may not realize many of the acts, legislation that was passed in London was extremely damaging to us economically. We couldn't get capital into the country. We had no access to paper money, fiat currency. And this offended and alienated large numbers of people in the United States. So these committees of correspondence began working. These committees became the foundation for the Continental Congress. They ultimately became the replacements for the old parliamentary bodies that existed in all of the colonies. We need committees of correspondence now. They need to be people, groups of people who are committed all across the country who are linked electronically through encryption. And they need to begin working soon to put together the cadre that must take over in the future. And we don't know when this economic disaster is going to finally collapse. But we know the financialization of our economy has not worked. The financialization of our economy makes a tiny minority that sits up in New York City rich, and the rest of us are on the sidelines. They've turned Wall Street into their personal casino. This won't last. It will fall apart. And many up there privately know it and are now trying to find places to put their money outside of the United States. Gee, what a surprise. So, these committees of correspondence have to come together. And then they need to be prepared to invite others in who are not there yet. Many of these should be veterans. You have many veterans now who understand what a catastrophe we've created in this country over the last 20 years. They see what's happening. We have to identify them, we have to pull them in, they have to become part of us. It's not going to be easy, but we've got to do it because the survival of our country is at stake. And there are lots of people around the world that are already celebrating our demise.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting, very recently, President Putin gave a speech, and he made several points. The first point was untrue. It was the only untrue statement he made, but I understand given his background and why he would say capitalism doesn't work. No, capitalism actually absolutely does work, but we haven't had true capitalism.
Yes.
But all of the other points that he made are things which all of us in this room would agree to. C.S. Lewis, I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He gave brilliant lectures, and in one lecture he talked about the moral dilemma that confronts the West, and he said, the world is upside down. Our country is upside down. It will not right itself. But when the implosion comes, based upon what I've seen of these people in Washington, D.C., they have no idea what's coming. They are arrogant to the point of absurdity. They are ideologues who think that they are destined to conquer everything and rule everyone. I think they're very wrong. But we need to get to work, because somewhere out there is probably someone like Lenin who could organize it and oppress us effectively. But right now, once you get below the senior levels, down into the various federal agencies and in the armed forces, there are a lot of patriotic and solid Americans who don't like it. But their pay, their income, their lives are hostage to the system. But when the system collapses, that will all change. When did Paris revolt against Louis XVI in 1789? When the population could not afford to buy bread. So, we're dealing with lots of issues that you know more about in all likelihood than I do when it comes to inflation. You know, my view of economists is pretty much what John Kenneth Galbraith said. He said, economists exist to make astrologers look respectable. So, I pay no attention to what most economists say because I think they're almost always wrong. And I also pay tribute to you for coming in here tonight to listen to me and to talk to each other, and you must do more of this, more often. Not necessarily listen to me, but to talk to each other and work together, because our future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Woo!
Thank you so much, and we certainly do need to listen to more people like yourself. And just to open the Q&A session, and in light of what you've said, it may even seem a little superficial, but all of us are ramping up for 2022 election that is coming. And what I missed to do in the very beginning is we have one of the campaign directors for one of the candidates that we are looking at, and her name is Tricia Flanagan. Michelle here, Michelle Alberto is here, and she is her campaign manager. So for all of us looking at candidates like Tricia Flanagan, she's running for a congressional seat out of New Jersey, and Michelle is serving as her campaign director. Is it really viable for us? And obviously we're going to do it. We want to support these candidates. But are we fighting a losing battle, given that they're completely in charge now, the judicial system, everything that happened in 2020, that we think of all the shenanigans? Tricia is running in New Jersey in District number 3. She is running on America First policy. And it's a very winnable district. We have other candidates that are out there, some who are of Serbian-American descent as well. Are they fighting a losing battle right now? Because they will run on President Trump's ideas, on America First policies. But given that we've never solved 2020, are we up for another debacle in 2022 with all of the candidates that we're looking at, like Tricia Flanagan? And thank you, Michelle, for being here. Tricia has a event here with Newt Gingrich, actually, in Naples. We are looking at candidates out of Arizona, Senator running for Senate. He is Attorney General in Arizona, Mark Brnovich, who has been fighting this election battle, and he is actually Serbian. We have Sean Purnell up in Pennsylvania. We have Robert Kovic in New Jersey. A lot of people want to pursue President Trump's policies. What say you to us who are looking to win in 2022 and flip these seats?
It depends very much upon where you are. First of all, I don't even like to use the terms Democrat and Republican anymore. I instead think in terms of nationalists, Americans, and then the opposing camp, which is globalist and alien to us. And I keep trying to tell people, as you pointed out earlier, these people aren't Democrats. I grew up with Democrats, and they were very patriotic people that did everything they could to support and defend the United States. It depends on where you are. We haven't had a clean, fair election in Philadelphia since 1950, maybe. You know the joke. Everybody in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles votes whether they're dead or not. And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that. And you have the other problem that in many states where the left controls the polls, they'll bring in large numbers of illegals. I remember listening to a man who had voted in Alexandria, Virginia, came on, had a thick accent, talked about voting, and he said, well, where are you from? He said, I'm from Ukraine. He said, how long have you been here? He said, 3 weeks. He said, so you voted? He said, yes. And he said, you people don't care. Look, there is no rule of law that once existed in this country. It's gone. It's gone because we've ignored it. We've been complacent. You know, President Trump was surrounded by people who kept saying, you know, you can't intervene in these things happening in Chicago and Seattle. You have the election to think about everything else. My view was, if you don't go in there with force, it will not stop. We know from history that the only way to stop looting is to shoot a looter.
That's right.
Yes.
And Mao had an old saying, shoot one, educate a million. He wasn't wrong. You don't usually have to shoot that many people. But if you don't shoot them, it will not stop.
True.
And then, of course, we turn right around and want to imprison someone who does, defends his store. I've got a lot of contacts in the Korean community, and the Koreans, you know, are very heavily armed in Los Angeles. They're up on the rooftops, and the local population understands what they will do if you try to destroy their stores and things. We don't have that kind of cohesion as Americans. We need to have that. And we've got to get involved. You talked about the school boards, but it's also the police departments. We have a lot of police departments that are now infiltrated, just as the school boards are. And these people are ideologues. And there's no talking to them. You're not going to be able to debate these people and get them to see reality. So you've got to go in there and fight. And you're going to have to do it at risk to yourself.
Yes.
Yes.
We know that. There's no way around it. Now, will we prevail? It depends, again, on where you are and how much you can do. Do what you can in your community, where you live. That's all that you can do. You're not going to fix places in Rhode Island or Seattle or somewhere else or Los Angeles. Forget it. It's not going to happen. It's too late.
Right.
They're gone.
Right. They're gone.
Another question I had for you before we open up the panel for everybody else to ask questions. You mentioned quite a bit ago, and this is in relationship to foreign policy and NATO and bombing of Serbia. And I know President Trump fundamentally agrees with you on this and on the military-industrial complex, that NATO essentially was obsolete at a certain point in the 1990s, and then Yugoslavia fell apart, bombing of Serbia, unfortunately, and we have been on the receiving end of demonization of the Serbs as others have been demonized. Right after January 6th and right after this past election, Darren Beatty came out and said 70+ million Americans are now essentially Serbs of the 1990s. NATO has been obsolete, but you made a statement that NATO is obsolete. NATO actually needs to be out of business. But if NATO looks at what is happening in the United States today, they would literally declare a no-fly zone over the United States and maybe bomb us as well. So how do we fight this military-industrial complex that is so ingrained now within our realms? And certainly President Trump agrees with you on this. He has that gut feeling and common sense of what needs to be done. And how do we get ourselves out of the claws of the globalists and the bureaucrats that you and I have discussed, who are governing and shouldn't govern?
Okay, well, there are two answers. The first is that if there's something that's important in America, and perhaps more important, though maybe it shouldn't be, but it is, and almost anything else is money. And Americans are not going to be excited about the road that we are on economically in this country. You can't destroy energy the way we have as an industry and expect things to get better. The three great advantages that we have, one is clearly energy, the other is clearly agriculture, and then it's rebuilding our lost manufacturing base for high-tech industry. Those things we shipped overseas. Those are three things that we can do better than anybody else. We still have an abundance of land, we still have a large population, we got a lot of human capital. But you don't get there by bringing in people from overseas to displace American workers. And I've never heard so many people in Washington tell me, well, Americans are lazy, they're stupid. Oh, really? They don't really want to work, they don't want to do anything. Well, first of all, Biden has broken the code. He's figured out he can pay everybody to stay home. And that certainly helps. But the truth is not true. You know, if you go into the IT industry, in most cases people tell you the best people they have are Americans. The problem is that they want to get off the rodent wheel, you know, the little gerbil wheel. They get tired of being beaten up. But if you're from India or from any number of different places, you don't care as long as you get to come in, you get a ticket of admission to the consumption machine, and so you can get 2 or 3 of them to do what an American used to do. This has got to stop. That's an anti-American policy, and this government stands for that. 100%, so that's the first thing. I think the second is that we definitely have to make it clear that what we don't want. Some of you will remember that Obama was about to go out and make a public statement that we were preparing to bomb Syria. And at the time, I thought that was very interesting because I was very engaged with a lot of people on the Hill, and they told me their offices were just overwhelmed with calls and telegrams and tweets and emails saying, we don't want to bomb Syria. There will be no expansion into Syria. One of the things that you're seeing with the Biden crowd in the Middle East is the result of that, because this country has had it with that sort of thing. I don't think that you could get away with the Kosovo War campaign today. I think Americans say, what? I remember being asked by the Supreme Commander of Europe, when I came back, I was over in shape as the Director of Joint Operations. At first I was the Director of Strategic Planning for the Balkans, and I was alone. I left my family in the States for over 2 years. I had to do that because of the nature of the work. It was literally 6.5 days a week, 24 hours a day potentially. And I came back, and this was October of 1998. And he said, well, what do people in the United States think about this? I'd been in Colorado Springs, which is where my family was, and I said, well, the people in Colorado Springs think that Kosovo is a town hit by a tornado in Missouri. You understand? And people actually were talking, being interviewed, and they were talking about Slobodinians. Slobodinians. Who are these Slobodinians? They didn't say Serbs. They didn't know who the Serbs were. It was Slobodinians from Slobodan Milosevic. We've reached the point where I think most Americans in the electorate don't want this. But we have resisted referendums in this country on everything. Because the left has always known that if you put things to the vote, whether it is homosexual marriage or bombing someone somewhere, the very high probability Americans will say no. And so we have no referendums. So instead, what they do is they get elected, and then they put people in the judicial system and in the bureaucracy to rule us, who agree with them. This has been going on for decades. So now you're stuck. Elections are not referendums. Bureaucrats and courts do not rule. The Constitution was set up that way, but again, it's not working, which is why we have to have a second republic. But we're not going to get that second republic immediately. First, we're going to have to see this economic financial crisis crystallize and see the implosion. And then we need to be prepared to step in. Because if we're not, you're going to get more people from inside the Beltway. You can't trust these people. They're all bought and paid for. Ralph Nader, who was hardly a conservative, used to refer to Washington as corporate occupied territory. He's right. It's not just corporations, special interests, foreign lobbies. They occupy Washington. Money is everything. There's a book called The Swamp is Deeper Than You Think, written by a Congressman Buck from Colorado. Has a number of wealth trying to suppress it. But he's right. He talks about how as soon as he got there, he was told where he can go to get money so that he can finance whatever he wants to do. And if he doesn't get the money that way, he's not going to sit on any committees, he's not going to have any influence and so forth. The whole thing is rotten to the core, needs to go away. But it's not going to do that until we get the implosion. And the implosion is coming, I believe that. I can't predict exactly when.
And President Trump certainly did want to drain the swamp. I would like to ask you all, as you leave tonight, our wonderful sponsor, Hoey team, they brought constitutions. These little booklets here are in fact constitutions. Take it, read it. That is what is going to save our country. And I would certainly like to open the panel to all of you if there are any questions. I think we should have a discussion about how we are going to actually move